Science and morality. That's what we're here to talk about today. Now, it's a big topic, a lot of complexity to it. I only have about an hour to go through some of these things, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything with as much depth as I would like. But afterwards, I'd like to open up the floor, like everyone, those who would like to keep discussing to come. We'll have a kind of open Q&A discussion, rather than me just kind of standing here and batting off questions as you pitch them to me. We'll have more of a dialogue after the talk. There's plenty of good rebuttals to much of what I'm going to say, and I'd love to hear some of your ideas. I want to take you all back to 1915. Remember that date, right? Yeah. It was the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium, and a short, bald, pot-bellied man was standing, looking over the battlefield with a Virginia cigar. And it was a rough time in World War I. There were bodies of men strewn across the battlefield, bloated, torn apart by bullets and artillery. There were men in ditches, covered in mud. Some of them, their peers, some of their comrades being eaten by rats and flies. It was hell. And this man who was looking at all this was about to make hell worse. When he gave the signal, 168 tons of chlorine gas was released into the world. And the wind pushed it forward into the trenches. And the men had no idea what it was. They'd never seen anything like it. They started breathing, and they felt the burn of the chemicals in their lungs. They started to cough up phlegm and blood. And the line broke. People ran. When they came back to that position, they found some 5,000 people, 5,000 soldiers dead. They were ripping open their shirts and their tunics, trying to breathe. They drowned on land. Now, the man that was standing and ordered this gas attack was a man named Fritz Haber. He was the father of chemical warfare. About 4 years later, he was given the Nobel Prize, for good reason. Because Fritz Haber was also the man that invented a way to extract nitrogen from the air in the form of ammonia. This process saved billions of lives. Without it, the world population was predicted to cap off at 1.5 billion people. With it, it was able to provide food for billions and billions, and to this day, right now, about half the world population is being fed by the same process that he invented. About half the nitrogen in your bodies comes from this same process. Now, Haber also invented something called a pesticide called Zyklon, which later was adapted by the Nazis into Zyklon B and used in the gas chambers to kill Jews and others. The legacy of Fritz Haber is a complicated one. Right now, I want you to turn to somebody next to you, and I want you to talk. How do you come to grips with this legacy, with these scientific discoveries? How do we judge this man and these works? It's tough, I know. And that's why I'm only giving you 29 seconds. Go.
Fritz is the guy who decided.
I'd love to talk more about Haber after the talk, but I give his example because this is a case where science can be used both for good and for bad. It can be used to amplify the things that we value most: food, life. It can also be used to amplify death and destruction. And so in a way, it's an obvious sort of thing. It's a tool, right? Science helps us understand the natural world, but how we use it is, in a way, up to us. Science can help us achieve our moral ends, but is there a way for science to help us arrive at what those ends are? Can we use science to understand what we truly should value? Now, the Theistic Critique, and I believe there was a talk here a few months ago called The Reason for God, is basically that you cannot have true values, true morality, without some kind of godly presence. Everything is meaningless without God. There's no good, there's no bad. You don't really know, you can't really look at somebody and see them as an independent human being. Basically, they're all like volleyballs in the movie Castaway. Tom Hanks ascribes agency and purpose and personality to an inanimate object. That, they say, is what we are without God. Now, it's easy to scoff at this critique because there's so many atheists running around that are doing just fine. Not really killing too many people or troubling too many folk. Sometimes even helping an old lady cross the street. But it's not so easy to brush off this critique, because if you are an atheist, nihilism is a real problem, serious philosophical problem. And I would argue that if you have not seriously grappled with the idea of nihilism, then you have not seriously engaged with what it means to be an atheist, what it implies. Now, I believe that we can be good without God. I believe absolutely that we can do basically everything that the religious community does without appealing to the metaphysical. But how do we get there? It's not as obvious as it may seem. Now, science has given us so much insight about the natural world. We ourselves are part of the natural world. Might it be that we can understand what is right and wrong by experiment or by theorizing with enough data? And there's a kind of split, generally speaking, in the world of ethics about how we arrive at our values: moral realism and moral relativism. Moral realists, they say that there is a good and a bad, and we can, with enough study, with enough insight, arrive at what right and wrong truly are. Moral relativist comes back and says, well, if that was true, then we would expect there to be convergence on moral issues. That with enough debate, with enough evidence, we would be able to find that there is a kind of consensus that will form among certain issues. And we look out the world and we don't see this convergence happen. We don't see convergence in the realm of abortion. We don't see convergence in the realm of using violence. When is it appropriate to use violence? There are a whole host of different answers, different perspectives on it, and we cannot seem to arrive at definitive conclusions, at least not yet. And the moral realists would come back and say, yeah, but we just don't know enough. If we had two people arguing with enough clarity of mind, enough logic, enough data at their disposal, then eventually we should see convergence. They should be able to come up, shake hands, and arrive at a definitive moral conclusion. This is right, this is wrong. Now, the philosopher David Hume famously said, you cannot get an ought from an is. As much as you understand about the world, as much as you understand about how humanity functions, how humanity is, thinks, and how the physical laws of this world work, you will never be able to extract what you ought to do based on that knowledge. This is called Hume's guillotine that divides the ought from the is. And it's one of the central questions of ethics. Now, the new atheists, thinkers, people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Peter Singer, and Steven Pinker, they say that no, well, maybe we can. Maybe we can, with enough scientific rigor, with enough evidence, with enough experimentation, maybe we can come to an understanding of something, of a morality that is based on logic, on evidence. It is not just whatever we want to be right or wrong, or relying on some kind of deontological, godlike figure to give us what is right and wrong. So, let's take an example from psychology. Imagine that you are an employer. You get an application, and this applicant has a spotless, is a perfect fit for the job, has a spotless record, except for one thing. He was convicted of manslaughter several years back. He explains the charge. He was at a bar, and he was confronted by somebody who basically said he's sleeping with his fiancée. He laughed in his face and said, "If you're man enough, we'll take it outside." He took it outside. And in the ensuing fray, our applicant killed the other man, his nemesis. And in this situation, what would you do? Would you accept the candidate? Is this an acceptable time to use violence? Or not? Again, talk to people next to you. You have 15, 16 seconds. Go. All right, show of hands. We thought that, I'd hire this guy. Could have happened to anyone. Show of hands. No, not okay. So this was. Yeah, a lot of people are undecided. So this is taken from a 1996 study by Nisbet and Cohen, where they sent these applications to employers, and they found a difference between the North and the South. Employers in the North and employers in the South. There's a difference. What's that?
The North and South USA?
North and South USA, yeah. North and South USA. There was a different conception of what was tolerable, when it was tolerable to use violence. And those in the South, they were much more inclined to hire the candidate.
North or the South?
In the South. Those in the North, not so much. Now, I'm not knocking the South. I love the South. I may actually be moving to the South soon. New Orleans is amazing.
You can change the story.
I might have to. But there is a a tradition of honor culture in the South. And honor culture arises from a kind of historical and structural phenomenon. Basically, there are multiple factors, but a large one is when the state is far away, when the state has little power over enforcing laws and keeping you safe, then you turn to your personal protection. You have to be the one to protect yourself. And this, in the South, there was basically, it came about from frontier culture, where there was no state early on. It was very weak. You couldn't. The only way to preserve your well-being or your cattle, your herds, was to take your safety into your own hands. And you also see this in many other parts of society, inner cities as well. Chronic problem where if you are in danger, you can call the police, but odds are they're not going to come, at least not right away. You have to be able to take care of yourself, and a large part of that is not taking insults. When somebody comes at you with an insult, you have to stand your ground and be able to retaliate with force if necessary. Now, this gives rise to a different conception of when it is okay and not okay to use force. And in this situation, if you're in the South with that mindset, it's perfectly acceptable to use force in this situation. For us in the North, not so much. But notice that this moral outlook is based in history, based in context. It's not that one, if we only had a little bit more understanding of the situation, if we had more information about what was going on. No, everybody knows exactly, gets the same exact information. And the real difference is an attitude towards that comes out of history, that comes out of a culture. And that's not something that you arrive at rationalistically. And we all have, we are all embedded in this history of moral evolution. Whichever country we come from, whichever part of the world, we have certain predispositions to one kind of action or another. Now, moral realists might say, well, that may be true, but still, if we had a sufficient understanding of sociology, of psychology, neuroscience, we can choose to deny our history, deny our instinctual reactions, and to choose a way of acting that is better for everyone. And let's say, most probably the better course of action, it seems to me, is to not resort to violence. Can we prove this? Can we say that there are really ideals, values that we can show to be logically true? If everyone was to be nonviolent, not react with violence to insult, that the world would necessarily be a better place. And there are philosophers that make this claim, that there are values we must have that are sacred in a sense. Daniel Shkolnik has his sacred values. That if we follow them, we will get to a better kind of world. Then its values are democracy, justice, life, love, truth. Alphabet. But there are also philosophers that come back to that. They say, no, not so fast. All these values that you just named, they are, whether you know it or not, actually based on metaphysical claims. You cannot support them with evidence. Or you think you can. And one of these thinkers is Ted Slingerland from the University of British Columbia in Canada. He says that really the whole Enlightenment project is actually a religion that denies it is a religion. Denies that its claims are based on some kind of metaphysical values. Now, he points to Charles Taylor's work. He says, Charles Taylor has this idea, this distinction between weak evaluations and strong evaluations. Weak evaluations is, I like vanilla ice cream, I don't like chocolate ice cream. Nobody's going to be spilling any blood over that. It's a preference, we all understand. But there are also strong evaluations. And these are beliefs that are normative and that we want, and that are also intolerant. For example, child slavery. I believe that child slavery is wrong. I don't say, well, it's wrong for me, but you go ahead. If you like it, go do it. No, it's not like ice cream flavors. We have a sense of normativity. We have a sense that this value should be universally applied, universally held. Now, the claim that Taylor makes is that this is really something that we cannot support with any kind of experiment. That this is an appeal to a metaphysical claim, a metaphysical idea. That children have an inherent innocence. They have something that cannot be violated. That to do so is innately wrong. Now, another example of this is another value of mine. Slavery. Slavery is bad. Slavery is something that is innately evil. That's what I believe. But if you were to question me on this, to really push and say why, I might say, well, why? I don't feel like I have to give an explanation. It's just bad. Every individual has an innate dignity. Push me on it again. Well, why? I start feeling uncomfortable. Start to sweat a little bit. Well, it's just because it's right. It seems right. I can't prove to you that human rights exist. There's no experiment that I can do. There's no X-ray I can take of you to find where human rights exist in your body or in your brain. This is something that we decide, we value. It's something that we try and uphold in our societies. And you could take the functionalist approach and say, well, we don't want slavery because slavery is antithetical to the kind of world in which we don't go around taking each other's freedom away from one another and subjecting each other to work for whoever is most is bad and can never be good. Can never be good. It's a hard question because at the same time as we'd like to say that we will never, ever resort to these horrible kinds of things, we also have to realize that much of civilization has been built on the backs of slaves. This country, as well as others, Rome and the Netherlands, slave trade, really, it's happening even now in the world today. There are actually more slaves in the world than there have ever been. Proportionately, it's smaller than it has ever been. But in terms of child slave labor, West Africa is a hot spot. Chocolate actually is made from slave labor. The cocoa beans are picked that way. Most of our cars are made with steel that is made in furnaces fired by coal. It was extracted in Brazil, also slave labor. And there's, not to mention, sexual slavery and other forms. It's something that is truly unfortunate because while it is legal nowhere, it happens practically everywhere, including Europe and the US. And so we come, I think, to what the core of morality is. as I see, morality is, I believe, a vision that we have for the world. We have goals, we have values, we take these on because we have a sense that this is how the world ought to be. We may not have evidence to support our sense, but our sense is there. And the ways in which we act, the ways in which we develop our lives, develop our laws, develop our governments, are based around these different visions. Now, there are arguments, I think good ones, to be made for trying to find rules and ways in which to create a world that is good for everyone. And Steven Pinker, in his new book, Enlightenment Now, has tried to put forth several ways in which we can take on humanism and make that the core of atheistic morality. And I think, in large part, I agree with most of what he argues. He makes a variation on the golden rule. He says, progress consists of deploying knowledge to allow all of humankind to flourish in the same way that each of us seeks to flourish. And I agree with that. For the most part, I agree that flourishing, human well-being, is something that we should try and optimize, something that we should try and spread through the world. But there is a problem with this rule. What happens when our ideas of flourishing differ? What happens when our visions for the world are not the same? Now, it's not hard to find different visions for how the world should be. Republican, Democrat, Libertarian. We're looking at environmental visions for the world. Environmentalists would say, some would say we should step back from all this technological driving and go back to a simpler way of living, return to the earth. On the other hand, you have those environmentalists that say, no, we should continue pushing forward with technology until we can undo all the bad that technology has already caused. There are different visions for how we should progress. And I believe that every pronouncement of we should or we ought carries with it a certain vision for the way we want the world to be. So where does science come into this? What can we learn from the science we pursue? If any?
You didn't do that, did you?
No, I
Would you mind? Okay.
Automatically different vision.
That's a different vision for this talk. No. The lighting is wrong. Let me help you out. Maybe just stick with this. Anyway, I'm gonna keep going. So, is there something we can learn from science with regards to morality, with regards to how to act? I think that for the most part, I agree with David Hume that we cannot get an ought from an is. But I think that there are ways in which we can find patterns and learn from science successful ways of improving the world. Because the fundamental vision of, I think, most of the moral realists and new atheist thinkers is that we can get better at being human. We can get better at creating societies that produce more peace, more happiness, more productivity, more satisfaction. I agree with that. So, science can be a tool for doing just that. But I think also it can give us some important lessons on its own, learning from the discoveries that have been made and the ways in which they've been made. The first one, and there may be more, but I think the two major ones that I see right off the bat are human ability and humility. First one should be pretty obvious. Science proves again and again and again that humans are able to conquer bit by bit the uncertainty of this world. We're able to create and craft a world that is better suited to our needs, to our values. Whatever the solution, whatever the problem is, with enough work, with enough patience, with enough thought, and we can come up with a solution and constantly improve on that solution. But we shouldn't assume that this means we are on the way towards solving all problems, that we are on the cusp of being gods. Maybe we are, I'm not sure. I don't think that's the right take. I think really all of this kind of triumphalism that we can take from the scientific accomplishments of the past several centuries should be balanced with humility. Because while science proves again and again that we can expand our powers, it also shows us how small, how frail, how deluded we are again and again. And you can look at psychology, the work of Daniel Kahneman, who has shown that won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that humans are not as economically rational as we might think they are. Surprise, surprise. He had a whole slew of different fallacies that his research uncovered, one of which is the undue confidence that we have in what our mind believes it knows. Another is the tendency to address problems in isolation, to focus on isolate variables, as science so often does, but forget the bigger picture. He also has a critique of Daniel Bernoulli's idea of economic utility. We are rationalistic actors in the economic sphere. We are not. Outside of psychology, we can also look at the work of Carl Sagan, or maybe not his personal work, but the thing that he constantly emphasized, that science can be looked at as really a progression of discoveries that undercut human vainglory. We thought that humanity was at the center of the universe. We found out that it's just one planet on the outskirts of the solar system. Not the outskirts. But then we find, okay, well, perhaps the sun is somehow central to the cosmos. Nope. Again, is out on the edge of the galaxy, and that galaxy is on the edge of a galactic cluster. We are very small, and we are just beginning to find out how small we really are. Einstein, after completely reconfiguring our understanding of space and time, didn't go about with the swagger, thinking that, well, humanity is really on the cusp of unlocking all secrets. No, he had a basic humility for what the human mind can know. And he would, quoting him, he said, "We see a universe marvelously arranged, obeying certain laws, but we understand the laws only dimly. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious forces that sway the constellations." And he said that he was actually not an atheist, because atheists know something that he does not, that there is no God. And Carl Sagan also could not ascribe himself to full atheism. He admitted that there were certain things that we cannot know, we do not have evidence to disprove. So I think fundamentally what science teaches us is that yes, we have a unique ability to create the world in the way that we want to see. We have a unique ability to painstakingly mold the world to our values and bring our values into being. But we should also hold on to a belief in doubt. Socrates had a formula. He said, I am the wisest man because I know how little I know. I know that I know nothing. Everybody else thinks they have all these answers. True wisdom is a modesty. It comes from that. No scientific achievement came from a kind of brazen certainty that the answers were already known. It came from skepticism. It came from doubt. It came from investigation. So I think we need to have confidence in our abilities, in our reason, in our experimental techniques. They have been proving themselves again and again for decades. We should have confidence, but we should not have arrogance. We should not assume that we can find universally applicable moral codes. We should not assume that our idea of the universe, because maybe it implies that there is no metaphysical God. We can maybe disprove miracles or prayer, disprove or cast doubt on the sanctity of the foundational texts of a belief. We will never be able to actually disprove the metaphysical claims. There is some kind of greater force, some kind of greater arrangement to the universe. But we don't have to believe it unless there's evidence. I think there isn't much. Maybe not at all. But I think that also there is an importance, I guess, looking at the world and trying to be honest with ourselves about what we know, what we don't, and what kind of world we would like to create. Now, right now, we have a little bit of this. Oh, nice. So, right now, as many of you know, there is a civil war raging in Syria. It's been 7 years running. And it is one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes of our era. Started off the talk talking about chemical gas attacks. Chlorine gas, that same gas that was released in the first chemical attack, is being used in Syria in barrel bombs. Here it says barrel bombs, sometimes filled with chlorine, are being the biggest killer of civilians in Syria today. Our unarmed and neutral rescue workers, white helmets, have saved more than 99,220 people from attacks in Syria, but there are many that we cannot reach. There are children trapped in rubble we cannot hear. And then the UN Security Council must follow through on its demand to stop the barrel bombs by introducing a no-fly zone if necessary. Technology is a great tool. It can give us great amounts of knowledge, technology, and ability. It can give us the ability to change the world for the better or destroy it. It's not hard to sign a petition Technology that we have around us and the infrastructure we have around us today is like no other that we've ever had in our history. We should take advantage of it. We should use it for moral good. It's not hard to go and support the people and the things that you find meaningful, the causes that you believe are worth fighting for. Just a few clicks, you can help support the kind of world that you want to see. Now, just talking about morality doesn't get us anywhere. The Buddhist teacher, Nagarjuna, very much like the Buddha himself, said that theory is an obstacle to practical moral action. Just talking about metaphysics, talking about what it means to be good is not enough. You have to take action. And I think, as a humanist, I'm willing to stand by my words. I know what kind of world that I want to create. I'm willing to stand by it. I'm willing to choose one kind of world as opposed to another. A world in which we allow chemical warfare to happen is not a world that I want to live in. A world in which we allow child slavery to happen is not a world that I want to live in. I don't have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt some kind of logical theory, some kind of scientific evidence that this is right or wrong. No, I choose the kind of values that I want to live for and die for. And I go about trying to bring those into the world. Technology and science are tools. They are a process. And I believe that if we use them well, we can truly create a world worth living. But we will never be absolutely certain that what we're doing is absolutely right. I believe we don't have to. We should be taking an existential stand on the kind of world we want to create. And as scientific study continues, we will better understand what makes our world more pleasant to live in, more worthwhile to live in, to make our pieces more deep, more long, make them longer, make them deeper. We can find out ways in which we can make our lives more satisfying to ourselves and to others. No matter how much information, no matter how much data, no matter how much thought we put into these questions, we will always have justification for choosing one version of the future as opposed to another. And that may be a sad truth, but some people want to create a kind of world in which the values they hold are different from our own. I think that it will be always inevitable unless we somehow create a sort of hive mind and live as one unified entity. We will always have competing visions of how this world should look. I think that is a good thing. I think we should have alternate visions. We have to always ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want? One in which we belong to the whole planet, or just to our country? A world in which science is used as a tool for profit, as a tool for healing, a tool for making weapons, or as a tool for making medicines? A world that prioritizes wealth and material material prosperity, or a world that emphasizes inner richness. We will always have to make a choice about what kind of earth we want to create. And once we make that choice, we'll have to defend it. Thank you. I'd like to invite those who would like to participate in a broader discussion to please speak up. Yes?
You've gone what sounded like two different ways at the end. One way is just sounded, you used the word existential at one point, it sounded like it's just a free gratuitous choice and you can choose and then you do whatever you've chosen and go that way. And if someone else chooses to make people, to enslave people, well, that's his choice, you just made another choice. But at other times you said you used good or well or pleasant and seeming to show, and I think you even said something about choosing well. So those are two diametrically opposite ways to go. And we say that there are reasons you think to choose one way and then we can't be sure we're right, but we think we're right. And it's not just something that's based in our having chosen that, or not.
Yeah. No, it's a. So I'm of the belief that it is always a kind of existential choice as to which path we take. We can choose to optimize and fight for a world where there is a kind of, as Daniel Dennett was saying, a world where we emphasize democracy, justice, love, truth. But in the end, it is an existential choice that we have to make as human beings. And choosing well and choosing rightly exists within that paradigm, I think. That we define our values and define our worldview. And then we do rightly by trying to create that world and bring that into being.
That sounds very close to the radical relativism, because it's, or really, to be more exact, what's sometimes called subjectivism, which is something like relativism, but not between societies, but for each individual.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I will admit that's the view that I take of the world. I think that that is the honest way to look at the world. It's not an easy way to look at the world.
That's the only honest way you're saying?
For me. I think there are others. I mean, and there are legitimate other ways of looking at morality. I think that there definitely can be claims made for that things are not completely relative.
You're just suggesting it was honest for you, but maybe not honest for me. You know, that's another good level of relativism or subjectivism one can get to.
So I think I can connect to that discussion on because as you were speaking, I'm a physicist, and I was just pondering a general question of the connection between science and morality. And in fundamental physics, to make it very simplified, there's a belief that everything is described by some mathematical equations. And these equations cover all of space-time. And they have solutions under the right conditions. And in principle, that explains everything. It's not a complete explanation. But Richard Feynman and maybe some others made the observation that it doesn't matter what you call things. So, and it doesn't matter, you know, if I think of the particles in this table or the particles in a rock in Afghanistan, or, you know, they're all instances of the same thing. And as I thought about this, I made the connection to the golden rule, because one way I think of the golden rule, or the categorical imperative of Kant, which is, I think, pretty much the same thing. I should make a decision or I should have an opinion about your decision as if we were exchangeable. That's how I interpret it. And all of us can look at each other and even if we're very different, see that we're somehow almost the same thing. And I think science is giving us a little guidance that way, saying, let's try to see the commonality between all these things we experience. And that if we can be mature enough or something, or enlightened enough to see that commonality in different people, I think that will solve a lot of these moral questions. Because there's no question of harming another. Am I justified in harming you? No, you're me. A lot of these questions will get reduced if we can reach that point.
So kind of, yeah, it's something that, you know, if we look at humanity as, you know, kind of, well, we are in many ways we are exactly the same, more or less. Our DNA is pretty much identical across the globe, and we think and we react in pretty much the same ways, or predictably, for most things. But still, there is enough. You know, one of the things that I think is frustrating, especially, you know, I studied sociology back in college. You know, coming from a desire to study physics. You know, in physics, you have this kind of assurance that the particles in one room are going to be the same across the universe. But with human minds, and you know, which is really the kind of sort of elementary particle, so to speak, of morality in human society, they're not quite the same. They work different ways. They come from different histories and contexts, and I believe there we're working with actually different kinds of matter, so to speak, and so I think that if we really were all just kind of living in the same sort of place, it would be easier to come to consensus. But we have such a fragmented history, fragmented conceptions of right and wrong and morality. I think there's also there's an added difficulty that you don't see in the natural sciences.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was very interesting that you brought up the example of manslaughter, because manslaughter is indicative of how we divide our justice system into intentional and unintentional crime, which is perhaps a reflection of a more biblical sense of morality, which is unintentional and intentional sin. And you seem to withhold this division of right and wrong as unintentional and intentional, as almost, and maybe perhaps sinning by thought, sinning by deed, as judgment metrics, as they seep into your more secular morality. But I'm like, I can't help but think of Sophocles and his depiction of Oedipus, where Oedipus is found guilty of patricide, not because he knew he killed his father, but because the commission of the deed, no matter what he knew, unintentionally or not, was wrong. That's kind of like perhaps a more Greco, pre-Christian thought of morality. So I guess my question is, can you have a developed moral system that is not Judeo-Christian, kind of unintentional, intentional sin, or any kind of relation to this like world of where we've derived a lot of how we judge people with this, maybe we're not even consciously thinking about it, but with this foregrounding in how we like conceptualize sin in a more biblical sense, and then making that into judgment calls about right and wrong.
So whether or not we can escape the kind of cultural, the place, the influence that religious conceptions or past conception of morality
yeah.
Now.
If you can say, you're secular and all, but if you're still dividing right and wrong as a question of intention,
right.
Have you really escaped the kind of threshold of the impact of religion on your thinking?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think it's very, if it's possible to escape it, I think it would be very difficult, or maybe it isn't. Maybe we're constantly beholden to our past, and to the kind of religious, or the moral ideas that have come before us. But I don't know, I'd like to also open it up. Does anybody else have any intuitions about that?
First.
I was just going to say, to throwing it in, I'm puzzled also by the need to see a secular world as like what we do without the biblical narratives, because there's thousands of other cultural narratives that have arisen around the world that explain a view of what humans thought the world should look like. And I'm also puzzled, why is it that, and maybe I heard you wrong, why does atheism produce nihilism? That as a person who was raised secular, that puzzles me. Like, why would you need to be nihilistic?
It's not that you need to be nihilistic. I think that it implies basically that if there is no grounding, metaphysical grounding to your morality, then if you keep on asking why, a religious person would run up against, well, it's because it is right in a universal way. There is some universal truth that we can get down to. Maybe we don't know what it is exactly, maybe we can't prove it, but you run up against some kind of either a God or a commandment, or maybe you don't even know what it is, but you know that it's out there. If you do not believe in that kind of metaphysical existence, then what do you run up against? When do you hit a barrier to that regression? I would argue that it's...
Why do you have to hit a barrier to it?
Who cares?
Yeah, why does that imply nihilism?
It's like, in my lifetime, we're probably not going to unify gravitation and quantum mechanics. We can still have science. It's okay. Someone someday will.
Yeah, no, I mean, and in a sense, that's partly my point, that we don't have to hit a finite barrier. I actually don't think we can. I think that really, what we have to do is we have to take a stand and we say, this is the thing that I value. I value it because this is the vision of the world that I'm looking to create.
That feels right to you.
Yeah, I think that is the hard part of this claim, is that, as this gentleman was saying earlier, what's your name? Leonard. It sounds a lot like moral relativism, and moral relativism is nothing but a nicer way of saying nihilism. And the
Really? Are you sure?
absolute moral relativism.
You could think one's real for us and another's real for the people.
There's, I think, the point that I'm trying to make is that we don't have real access to the real. We don't have access to it through experimental means or through rational means. If there is a real right and wrong, I don't think we either have gotten to a way of accessing it. I don't think we ever will.
People have given a very different foundation for secular morality. The ancient Epicureans claimed that we perceive that pleasure is good through perception. And they thought there were some gods floating around in interstellar space, but they didn't have anything to do with making things right and wrong, good and bad. So the ancient Epicurean view was pleasure is good, and morality is a convention, so that we live pleasantly.
Yeah. So no, I would also like to live pleasantly, but to say that this is a universal truth, on what basis? This is universal in the sense that we as living things perhaps would like pleasure more than pain, but
not that we want it. That the claim was that just as we perceive that there's a tree over there, we perceive the goodness of pleasure. That was the ancient Epicurean view, There was a view that was not based in divine commands. It thought morality is the result of convention, but conventions made for good reasons, so that we can live together pleasantly.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, that is a great way of going about making a moral system. I think that is perfectly practical. And in a way, it's a variant of you know, the ideas of humanist morality. You find ways in which to help people attain well-being and flourishing. And I think that is something that we should hold on to, we should try and bring into the world. But I do not think that we have an ability to claim that this is actually a truth, an actual moral truth. This is something that is convenient, practical for our biology, for our psychology, for our societies.
Okay, so a couple quick things.
Sure.
Your question was whether or not it's truly a secular viewpoint on the world if you're still borrowing from older ideas from other viewpoints of the world. And I would argue that kind of the idea of secularism is that you take good ideas from wherever you find them, especially if they stand up under scrutiny. And I think intent versus non-intention is at least a starting point for a legal framework, if nothing else. And a lot of what we secular people, I believe, would call morality, I don't know that I would even call it morality. I would put it under the headings of ethics. And so I think that if something is ethical, you could look at it through the lens of morality if you wanted to. But I don't know, I just think that society is evolutionary, just like everything else that we find. Ideas get better over time. We pare away the ones we don't like. We end up with better results as we move forward. It's not always a linear process. It's not always. Sometimes we go backwards. There's good evidence for that right now. But that's so. I'm an atheist. Like, I will gladly take that step and say it. But I still borrow from Judeo-Christian stuff. I still borrow from anybody that I feel like had a good idea. The other thing I wonder about is, before I lose my train of thought, is I guess like the whole nihilism thing. Why does there have to be absolute truth? I don't like the whole idea of there needing to be absolute truth for morality to exist. I don't think that science has very much to say about morality except in the study of like anthropology, finding that morality exists in primates and other animals, even lower evolutionary form. Like there's lots of good scientific evidence that morality predated humans.
Humanity.
Yeah.
So like, that's, to me, a very important understanding that science has provided us. So.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I think that if you look at other species, you find ideas of fairness in primates, even in dogs. Cats too.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Not always. Yeah, and I think that realizing that a lot of our instincts in terms of what is right and wrong come from something very practical, kind of evolutionary backdrop, and I think that that is something that we can really something we should cling to instead of trying to reach for absolute truths, an absolute a sense that there's an absolute right or wrong, and we should acknowledge that we are indebted to our evolutionary lineage. We are indebted to the earth, to really we look out for one another because we are fighting against an impartial world, a world that doesn't particularly seem to care about us, whether we live or we die. The universe, it just kind of keeps on ticking, and the ways in which we've evolved are to help us survive, help us cooperate. I think that really is a great deal of where our ethics and our morality do come from.
But where does the idea that the universe should care about us come from? Isn't that
well, I mean,
I
don't think it should care.
Yeah.
Which but many people do. A lot of from the theistic perspective, there is many people that like to think that there is a friend in the sky that is looking out for us and is kind of tending the light at the end of the tunnel.
But there's other theists who believe different things, like in the Haudenosaunee creation story. The world was created by the collaboration of the right-handed and the left-handed twin. The right-handed twin made the rivers, and the left-handed twin put in the rapids. The right-handed twin made the rose, and the left-handed twin put on the thorns. And that's why you should never expect things to go your way more than 50% of the time. And you know, I don't literally believe that, but it's a narrative that frames up a different kind of world that's you will find the benign and you will find the inconvenient equally. Just as a proof with our moving blackboards here tonight.
There probably was some kind of system to sort of like specify the right-handed twin versus the left-handed twin to get some figures, right? And that system of view on the world.
It's a system of view that things there are different things, you know, there are different forces of good and forces of inconvenience that just naturally exist, and that's the way the world is. And if you are raised with that kind of a narrative, then I don't think you feel like the you know, uncaring universe is like pitted against you.
Yeah, and right. If you're raised with a narrative that there is some explanation to things, there is some order or creation story, you know, that has kept this up. I think it's incredibly useful. But I think with the discoveries that we've made in science, we seem to be undermining this sense that there is kind of purpose to things. That there's a purpose that we've been created. There's a purpose for why the
Who gave us that sense though, other than like the biblical narratives, which are written by man, right?
Yeah.
Those were a story.
Yeah, I think there seems to be among humans a kind of desire to feel like there is a meaning, a desire to feel like there is, you know, something. Things happen for a reason, and we also have this tendency to not everyone, but to think that okay, there is a real right and a real wrong. You know, the ideas that, you know, all of this is just kind of practicalities that come out from evolution. It's kind of dispiriting, can be a dispiriting notion. And yet, I think that there are ways of really, in taking this seriously, taking this view that it is, you know, a result of evolutionary convenience, practicality, and still find beauty in the world, despite holding that belief.
I am a moral realist, and so that's kind of where my question stems from. And I guess I wanted to ask you, like, you know, when I introspect, I have a range of beliefs that are not necessarily verifiable, but they just seem to be true. So, you know, among these beliefs are, you know, my name is Phil, I was born in New York, there are no, you know, even prime numbers other than 2. My senses give me accurate beliefs, my memory is true, you know, I ate breakfast this morning, and, you know, kind of these very, like, foundational beliefs. And among these beliefs, I also find myself believing that it is objectively morally wrong to, you know, torture and sterilize a homosexual, or, you know, child slave, or things like this. And I guess, you know, so I have different, you know, perceptions of truth statements. You know, I have this, you might call it a moral perception, that, you know, this is an objective truth. And I guess I'm wondering, like, why do you choose that one to say, oh no, here it's relative, when we have these other beliefs that we sort of take into consideration? I guess in my opinion, like, why should I say, you know, that one is not an objective truth, but these other ones I sort of do, you know, form a worldview on? But I guess in my opinion, to me they all seem to be true, sort of unverifiably. And it's like, why should I throw that one out?
Well, I guess, so I think, you know, we have, when we're talking about our name and our, you know, the place that we're born, what we eat for breakfast, you know, all these things, you know, we can fairly reliably, you know, say that, okay, I'm pretty sure that this is how it is. But I think if you start looking more a bit closer at it, these are constructs, mental constructs that we use to make sense of our identity, ascribing names to individuals. We call New York New York because we've invented boundaries for it, and we've invented a name for it. Really, it's just a place on planet Earth where I guess we could put numbers to it as well. But it's the world is kind of there, and the beliefs and knowledge that we have of it, even though we feel so certain of it, they're constructs that we throw onto the world with our mind, and morality, I would say, is exactly like that. We're throwing on schema, onto different people when they interact. We care about the ways they interact because it matters. Either their pain is going to result for them, or pain is going to result for you, or something. We have been evolved to interact with this physical world around us, and we can pretty much rely on these schemata to work most of the time. But we, I think, should also remember that this is all a form of convenience, ways in which we have created and crafted beliefs to make sense of a world that doesn't inherently have meaning. We give it meaning with our minds.
So, just like my impression of the barrier or the limit, one thing that I notice a lot of theists tend to do when they preach that their religion is good, they seem to appeal to things that we already kind of either intuitively or for whatever reason maybe reasoned ourselves into it, but things like that before our religion came along, people would sacrifice their children, and now they don't our religion imposes them to not sacrifice their children, so or bury their daughters alive or something like that. So it just seems like it's almost like circular, or if you get my drift, it's like they're appealing to something that we already know, so it's like, why don't we cut out the middleman kind of thing sometimes? And it's just, also they come back to the whole thing about like objective morality and whether it's moral because God says so, and furthermore, even if God says so, even if that's the standard for objective morality, there's still the question of why should you care what God thinks as well? I mean, I think that's a valid question. Like, why
should you care what God thinks? Well, if there's a heaven and hell out there as well,
well, I mean,
I would care.
But then, I mean, even humans can impose punishments on people, so and that's arguably more real punishments as well. Arguably, more perceptible, like objectively perceptible punishments. So, just wondering if you have thought about that from that perspective.
So regarding the first part, new religion comes along and says, look how much more civilized we are than what was before.
Mm-hmm. Or those people over the hill.
Right. Yeah, and I think the temptation there is to say, well, in a certain society there are kind of norms that develop, and if you're born into it, if you're raised in that society, it's easier to say this is the right way of doing things. But we can look back at I guess a kind of evolution of our sense of right and wrong, where as we have more and more technology, as we have more and more I guess less reason to do to harm one another, we can say like, oh, in the past they were doing these things that can be rational and morally just awful things. But if you go and ask those people originally, they see themselves, I would imagine, as justified in what they do. And it's not necessarily that there's really been a kind of progression towards a real truth of this is now the true morality. It's more that we've adopted a new norm, and what was normal before we look back on and assume that it's pagan and awful.
I mean, people thought the world was flat earlier, and thought that. I mean, some people still do, but
unfortunately,
but
yeah.
generally, at least, or thought that disease was caused by the spirits or something like that, and it just seems like we tend to look at ourselves back in those days. I mean, if we were back in those days, maybe most of us would have thought the same, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, like, when especially we talk about people in the past, their science was underdeveloped,
Right.
and their morality was also, by our standards, underdeveloped, and science was by our standards underdeveloped as well. I'm sure in 1,000 years or 2,000 years or something like that.
They'll be looking back at us. And, well, that's the hope.
Yeah.
The hope that we, as we learn more about ourselves, will understand the patterns better. We'll understand, what makes for better, more peaceable societies. And I think that really, humans we're predisposed to like life, because otherwise we wouldn't be living things. It wouldn't make sense for living things to not like life. We're predisposed to liking and pleasure, and there are all sorts of patterns that I think we can really point to in our biological history and our reality as living things, and say that this is kind of innate and to us. It's not, some people have tried to say, well, we can extrapolate and say, for all sentient beings, really the only kind of rational thing that you would try and pursue is an optimization of well-being, or an optimization of some kind of flourishing. Maybe that's true. I think that we are dealing with a sample size of 1 in terms of sentient beings. So I think it really, we do have to remember that we are grounding a lot of what we think is right and wrong, and what would be, ideal for ideal world for humans may not be an ideal world for other creatures. In fact, other creatures are slowly finding out that the more, the closer we get to our ideal world, the further it is from theirs. I think it really, we should remember that we're based in a really concrete genetic lineage.
What you just said reminded me of another idea, which is if we pose a ethical question, I think we might answer the question differently if we think of it as in terms of this instant or this era that we live in versus like all of time. Because earlier you were talking about how humanity has increased its power to control its environment. I'm paraphrasing. Maybe. But we've also created all these risks now, which might destroy us tomorrow or in a few decades or centuries. And so on a much longer time scale, we could be heading in the wrong direction. We won't know unless we make it through.
Yeah.
So if we, and each of us would make a different choice maybe if we knew we were going to live forever, or we knew we were going to die tomorrow. We really knew. But if we thought of, again, it's like I was saying about seeing yourself and the other, there's also like our descendants to think about. And we're not very good at thinking that way. But if we were, I think we make some different assessments of morality.
Yeah, I agree. I think we don't actually know if we're heading down the right path. I think we like to think that we are, that progress is being made, and we are, even if we're kind of fumbling and stumbling, we are stumbling forward and upwards. but there are plenty of arguments that have been made, and recently the kind of the Neolithic Revolution, really kind of going from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society. What's that?
It's a big mistake.
Yeah. A lot of arguments that say that was a huge mistake. It was catastrophic in terms of the amount of people were working more. They were getting less calories from it. There were all sorts of new diseases that sprouted up as a result of that. Suddenly, you had the ability to tax people's kind of crops as they grew up, and suddenly you had all this the ability of making empires now because of taxation. That's one of the theories, but now you have to deal with taxes. And is that really progress? No, but it's there are all these unintended consequences of progress, and I think I like to think of it as we're chess players. We're like children coming up to a chessboard, and we vaguely understand the rules. And there are real patterns, real ways in which to play well. We have no idea what they are. And we're kind of like fumbling around trying different things. But in reality, we are very bad chess players at this point. We can't, anytime we try and change the world for the better, sometimes it works, sometimes we just make more problems than we solve. But I hope that I have a faith that we can improve our game.
Yeah, it's almost 9. Well, please thank. Let's give the round of thanks. And I just want to make a few announcements before everyone heads out. So, first of all, everyone's welcome to hang on for a bit, chat with us, have a second or third round. This plenty food is really good. Yeah. And hope you all fill out your sign-in feedback forms or grab one if you haven't already. Just want to. So our next big event, and we're really excited about this. This is our fourth Course Zero event. So it's the same series, and that's going to be starring two philosophy faculty members, Alex Byrne and Jack Spencer. They are both very much involved in philosophy of religion. So this is kind of one of their specialties. It's going to be a really fun event. That's about a little under 3 weeks from now. It's on Wednesday, March 21st at the same time. There'll be some catering. It's free, of course, as usual. It's going to be in a pretty big room, 6120. That's building 6. It's part of the main complex. And just want to, so there's that. And there's also, we've got a couple of other events lined up this semester. We have an Out and Out, our event series for ex-believers. And we're going to have Dr. Daniel Everett. He's a professor at Bentley University. He was actually a missionary. He actually went to convert some people in the Amazon, and they made him an atheist. So that's on April 9th evening, and we're going to have David Silverman. This is a really big one. We're going to have David Silverman, who's the president of American Atheists. We're going to have it. Well, it's shortly after Ask an Atheist Day, which is on the 19th. So we're going to have Ask the Atheist. This is going to be our associated event. That's on April 25th. And we're going to have maybe one more event for the rest of next semester. But we hope to see you at one or two or all of these events. We also meet up weekly. That's Tuesdays at 5:30 p.m. That's in the Stratton Student Center, way across campus, but it's at 84 Massachusetts Avenue, 4th floor, room 450. We have some snacks and tea and hot chocolate, and we have a different activity. Sometimes we have some kind of personal reflection thing, or the upcoming one is a game night. We're going to play some tabletop games, so hope you'll join us for that. Some help is always welcome. If you, of course, please fill in the feedback forms. That's very helpful to us. If you're a student or not even a non-student on campus, especially if you're a student and you'd like to, volunteer a little bit of your time, help us with setting up events, help us with greeting people, things like that. Yeah, we'd be very, very grateful. Also, if you're interested in being an officer, we would definitely like to hear from you. So please come and meet me afterwards. And if you'd like to donate something, we have a donate link on our webpage. It helps us absorb any unexpected costs and make events even better over and above the funding we get from the institute. So yeah, thank you. I'm Sohan D'Souza. I'm president of the society, and I'd like to meet you all while I'm wrapping up. So we're just going to wrap up for a bit, and then if you'd like to come with us to the Muddy Charles pub nearby, for some after conversation. Yeah, if you're 21 plus, I think. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
And please thank Daniel again.